It is early 1971. Berry Gordy, the founder and patriarch of Motown Records, is in his office, and he is not happy. Gordy is not just a record executive. He is a visionary, a general, the architect of the sound of young America. His company, built from an $800 family loan, has become a hit-making factory that has systematically dominated the 1960s, breaking down racial barriers on the pop charts. He is a man of singular vision and absolute control. On the turntable is a new, unreleased track from his biggest male star, his son-in-law, the man he had personally groomed for crossover stardom, Marvin Gaye. But this isn't the Marvin Gaye he knows. This isn't the smooth, romantic crooner who sang, "I Heard It Through the Grapevine," or the uplifting, joyful partner who sang, "Ain't No Mountain High Enough." This is something different. The sound is layered, misty, almost formless. It's built on a conga groove, a jazzy, melodic bass line, and a wandering saxophone riff that sounds more like a question than a statement. The vocal isn't a singular, powerful lead. It's a conversation, a multi-tracked choir of Marvin Gaye's, whispering, pleading, questioning. And the lyrics. The lyrics aren't about love. They're about war, about protest, about confusion and social decay. Gordy listens, and his reaction is immediate and visceral. He hates it. He pulls the record from the turntable and storms into the studio. He finds Marvin and reportedly tells him, in no uncertain terms, that this is the worst thing I ever heard in my life. He deems it uncommercial, a political diatribe, a career-ending move that will alienate the massive pop audience Motown has spent a decade meticulously building. He refuses to release it. The song is dead on arrival. But Berry Gordy, for all his genius, has miscalculated. He is not dealing with a pliable young singer anymore. He is dealing with an artist who is broken, grieving, and for the first time in his life, absolutely certain of his purpose. This is the story of that confrontation. It's the story of an artist who, horrified by the world around him, decides to risk everything, his career, his relationship with the man who made him a star, and the entire Motown formula, to release a song he could no longer keep inside. This is the rebellion that would not only save Marvin Gaye's soul, but would change the sound, purpose, and very definition of soul music forever. This is the story of What's Going On. To understand the magnitude of this rebellion, one must first understand the kingdom Marvin Gaye was rebelling against. Motown Records, or Hitsville, USA, was not just a label. It was a system, a total control philosophy. Berry Gordy, a former auto worker and failed record store owner, famously modeled his company on the Ford assembly line. He didn't just sign artists, he manufactured stars. He had a genius for identifying raw talent, but that talent was just the first piece of raw material. Gordy's goal was not political agitation. It was economic empowerment and cultural integration. He believed in his bones that the fastest way to win the fight for civil rights was to create a product so excellent, so irresistible, and so universal that white America had to buy it. He was fighting a war on the pop charts. In his view, a hit song on top 40 radio, sung by a black artist and loved by a white teenager in Alabama, did more practical good than a protest sign. He was using capitalism as a weapon against segregation. And his rules were strict because his goal was absolute. Raw talent was taken from the streets of Detroit and put through a rigorous, mandatory finishing school. This was Motown's International Talent Management, Inc., run by the formidable Maxine Powell. She taught artists how to speak, how to walk, how to handle themselves in interviews, how to exude class. "We are not crude," she would tell them. We are artists. We are gentlemen and ladies. She taught the Supremes how to glide, how to sit properly, how to never show their backs when leaving a stage, and how to speak to royalty in case they ever met the Queen. They were taught to be non-threatening to a white audience, to be ambassadors for their race who would be welcomed into any living room in America. They learned sophisticated choreography from masters like Charlie Atkins, who brought Broadway precision to the Temptations' intricate steps and gave the Supremes their elegant, flowing hand gestures. They were dressed in immaculate, non-threatening suits, sequined gowns, and processed hair. The goal was to create performers who were polished, professional, and most importantly, palatable to a mainstream white audience in a still segregated America. The music itself was the most controlled part of the assembly line. Gordy held weekly quality control meetings where every new song was put to a vote. Gordy himself had the final say. If a song didn't have that immediate, undeniable hit potential, it was sent back to the writers. The sound was meticulously crafted by the house band, the Funk Brothers, a collection of Detroit's finest jazz and R&B musicians who remained anonymous for decades, but were the heartbeat of the entire operation. Legendary writing teams like Holland Dozier Holland or Smokey Robinson would craft the songs, and producers would pit different artists against each other, recording multiple versions of the same track to see which one had the magic. The Motown sound was a brilliant formula. Driving, melodic bass lines from James Jamerson, tambourines on the backbeat, soaring string arrangements, call and response vocals, and a clear, treble-heavy mix that was perfect for car radios. But it was a formula, and one of its unwritten rules was simple: no politics. The sound of Young America was about love, dancing, and aspiration. It was not about war, poverty, or injustice. Gordy's mission was to provide escape, not a mirror to the harsh realities of the 1960s. He was building a black-owned business empire based on crossover appeal, and he would not risk it by being confrontational. Into this machine came Marvin Gaye. And from the beginning, he was different. He was handsome, charismatic, blessed with a 3-octave vocal range that could shift from a gritty gospel shout to a velvety, ethereal croon. Gordy saw him as the perfect romantic lead, the Prince of Motown. To solidify his place, Marvin married Gordy's older sister, Anna, in 1963. He became, literally, part of the family, a move that gave him a degree of protection, but also trapped him more deeply within the family business, making any artistic rebellion also an act of familial betrayal. And he became the star Gordy envisioned. He had a string of hits that defined the Motown sound: Stubborn Kind of Fellow, Hitchhike, How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You. Ain't That Peculiar? He was, perhaps, the greatest duet partner in pop music history. His pairings with Mary Wells, Kim Weston, and most famously, Tammy Terrell, were the absolute peak of Motown's romantic, uplifting pop soul. Songs like Ain't No Mountain High Enough, You're All I Need to Get By, and Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing were more than just songs. They were cultural events, perfect expressions of joyful, committed love. But beneath the polished exterior, Marvin Gaye was a man in turmoil. He was not a simple pop star. He was a deeply complex, sensitive, and troubled individual. He was the son of a strict, dogmatic preacher, Marvin Gaye Sr., a minister in the Hebrew Pentecostal Church. His relationship with his father was famously, tragically fraught with jealousy, resentment, and profound psychological pain. His father was a figure of terrifying, arbitrary authority, a man who, according to Gaye's biographers, envied his son's talent and fame, and took out his own frustrations on his children. This was not a peaceful household. Marvin's life was a tug-of-war, a constant battle between opposing forces. On one side, his father's strict fire and brimstone dogma, a world of judgment, sin, and the constant threat of damnation. On the other, the sensual, worldly allure of R&B and doo-wop, the music he heard on the streets and saw as a form of escape and expression. This conflict defined him. He was a man split in two, the saint and the sinner. He hated the Motown machine. He felt trapped. He idolized singers like Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, and Sam Cooke. He didn't want to be a pop soul singer. He wanted to be a crooner. He wanted to sing standards, to be seen as a serious artist, respected for his voice and phrasing, not just his ability to sell dance records. This desire wasn't just about musical taste. It was about seeking legitimacy. It was a search for a respectable art form that his father, who despised the perceived sinfulness of R&B, might one day acknowledge. He clashed constantly with Gordy over material. He would record his pop hits, often reluctantly, but he would also record albums of show tunes or jazz standards that Gordy would then refuse to release, or release with little promotion. His 1965 A Tribute to the Great Nat King Cole was one such act of rebellion, and its commercial failure only served to reinforce Gordy's control, proving, in Gordy's mind, that Marvin needed the hit factory. He was, in his own words, a puppet. He was the prince of Motown, but he felt like the prisoner of Hitsville. He was living in a golden cage, singing simple, happy love songs while the world outside his studio was on fire. The mid-1960s were a time of intense social upheaval. The civil rights movement was at its peak, and while Motown championed integration, it largely stayed silent on the more radical calls for change. The Vietnam War was escalating, cleaving the nation in two. And in 1967, the city of Detroit itself exploded. The 12th Street Riot, one of the most violent urban disturbances in American history, raged for 5 days. It was sparked by a police raid on an unlicensed after-hours club and escalated into a full-scale conflagration. The National Guard was called in. Federal troops, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, were deployed. Tanks rolled down West Grand Boulevard, just blocks from Motown's headquarters at Hitsville, USA. The sound of young America was now the sound of a war zone, the smoke literally visible from the studio windows. The illusion of Motown's safe, apolitical bubble was shattered. Artists outside the Motown bubble were responding with increasing urgency. James Brown released Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud in 1968, a direct, powerful anthem of black empowerment. Sly and the Family Stone were creating a multi-racial, politically charged funk with songs like Everyday People and Don't Call Me Nkukra Whitey. Even within Motown, the ground was shifting. Producer Norman Whitfield, sensing the change in the air, began pushing the Temptations into psychedelic soul with message tracks like Cloud 9, a song about escaping reality, Psychedelic Shack, and most pointedly, 1970s Ball of Confusion, That's What the World Is Today, a rapid-fire list of social ills. Marvin Gaye, meanwhile, was singing You're All I Need to Get By. He felt increasingly irrelevant, a court jester in a time of plague. The facade of his perfect life was beginning to crack. And then, it shattered. The first devastating blow came on October 14, 1967. Marvin was on stage at Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia, performing with his beloved partner, Tammy Terrell. They were the perfect couple, their on-stage chemistry so real that many assumed they were lovers, though they always maintained they were simply close friends. They were singing their hit, Your Precious Love, a song of perfect, effortless harmony. In the middle of the song, Terrell, who had been complaining of severe headaches for weeks, faltered, turned, her body went limp, and she collapsed directly into his arms. The music stopped. Marvin, in a state of shock, carried her off stage. The diagnosis was a malignant brain tumor. This event devastated Marvin Gaye. Tammy Terrell was more than just a singing partner. She was, to him, a symbol of the purity and joy that was missing from his own life. He watched, helpless, as she suffered through 8 grueling operations over the next 3 years, each one diminishing her, leaving her frail, blind, and weighing less than 90 pounds. He fell into a deep, profound depression. He felt a sense of futility, a dark, existential despair. How could he sing these joyful love songs when the person who embodied that joy was suffering so terribly? He reportedly vowed never to sing a duet with another woman again. He became a recluse, refusing to perform live for several years. His grief was so overwhelming that for some of her final duet recordings on the album Easy, Motown allegedly had him sing over pre-existing solo vocals from Terrell, a studio fabrication that must have felt ghoulish to him. The second blow came as a product of the world's chaos. While Marvin was grieving, his younger brother, Frankie Gaye, was serving a 3-year tour of duty in Vietnam. Frankie and Marvin were close, and Marvin had been receiving letters from the front. Letters describing a reality far removed from the evening news. When Frankie returned home in 1970, the two brothers talked for hours. Frankie recounted the horror, the fear, the confusion. He told Marvin about the friends he'd lost, the villages destroyed, the casualness of death. He described the fields of burning plains, the desperation, the jungle rot, and the intense racial tensions within the armed forces. He described the mistreatment of soldiers, particularly black soldiers, who were fighting and dying on the front lines for a country that still treated them as second-class citizens back home. They were fighting for freedoms abroad that they were denied in their own neighborhoods. These weren't abstract news reports. This was his brother's voice, shaking, telling him about the nightmares, about the moral ambiguity of the conflict, about the deep-seated trauma he now carried. For Marvin, already in a fragile, grief-stricken state, these stories were a breaking point. They personalized the distant, abstract conflict. This was no longer a political issue on television. It was his brother's trauma, his brother's nightmares, happening in his own home. He absorbed this second-hand pain, and it fused with his own personal anguish. The third and final blow came on March 16, 1970. Tammy Terrell, after 3 years of suffering, finally died. She was only 24 years old. Something in Marvin Gaye broke. He was done. He refused to perform. He refused to record. He went into a deep seclusion, reportedly not leaving his home for weeks. He was done with the happy love songs. He was done with the Motown formula. He was done with the entire charade, in a desperate, almost surreal attempt to escape his own identity. He began training, trying to get a tryout with the Detroit Lions professional football team. He was 30 years old, grieving, and completely, utterly disillusioned with his life and career. He showed up at the Lions training camp, befriending players like Mel Farr and Lem Barney, convinced he could make it as a wide receiver. It was, of course, a fantasy, but it was a fantasy born of a desperate need to find something real, something physical, to escape the artifice and pain of his life as a pop star. This is the state he was in when inspiration, in a strange, second-hand way, found him. Ronaldo Obi Benson of the Four Tops was a musician, not a political writer. But in 1969, his group's tour bus had been in Berkeley, California, during the Bloody Thursday protests over People's Park. Benson watched from the bus as police and National Guardsmen tear-gassed and violently clashed with young protesters, many of whom were just students. He was horrified. He saw picket lines and picket signs, and he asked, "What is going on here?" He took the idea to Al Cleveland, a Motown staff writer, and they sketched out a song. It was a mournful, questioning, deeply human response to the violence they saw. Benson brought the song to his own group, the Four Tops. They loved the song, but they were afraid to record it. It was a protest song, and that wasn't their brand. Their lead singer, Levi Stubbs, felt the song was too political and would alienate their audience. They were, in short, adhering to the Berry Gordy formula. Benson even offered it to Joan Baez, but nothing came of it. Finally, Benson approached Marvin Gaye. He found Marvin in his dark, self-imposed exile, still grieving Tammy, still processing Frankie's stories. Benson played him the rough draft of the song. For Marvin, it was a moment of pure, divine revelation. This song was not just a song. It was the question he was asking. It was the question his brother was asking. It was the question the whole world seemed to be asking. It was the key that unlocked his grief, his anger, and his confusion. He agreed to record it, but on one condition. He had to be able to add to it, to make it his own. He took their sketch and began to write. He added new lyrics, new melodies. He infused it with his brother's voice. "Brother, brother, brother, there's far too many of you dying." He added the perspective of the father and mother, a plea for dialogue. "Father, father, we don't need to escalate. Mother, mother, everybody thinks we're wrong." He was writing a dialogue, a plea for understanding between generations, between factions, between protesters and the establishment. In June 1970, Marvin Gaye finally returned to Motown Studio A, the legendary Snake Pit. But this session would be different. He wasn't just the singer. He was, for the first time, the producer. This was his rebellion. He called in the Funk Brothers, the legendary house band, but he ran the session his way. He wanted a loose, jazzy, almost spiritual atmosphere. He brought in players like Eli Fontaine on saxophone, the famous searching alto sax riff that opens the song. That was Fontaine warming up. Marvin heard it from the control room and yelled, "Don't stop! Keep it! Keep it!" He told Fontaine to play it as part of the song's introduction. This was unheard of at Motown, where every note was usually meticulously arranged by the producers. This freedom was intoxicating for the studio musicians, who were used to rigid charts and 3-minute structures. This session was a chance for them to stretch out, to be the world-class jazz players they were at night in Detroit's clubs. This was especially true for the legendary bassist James Jamerson. Jamerson, often underappreciated, was the melodic soul of Motown, his bass lines the secret hook of countless hits. On What's Going On, he was unleashed. He reportedly arrived at the session late, after playing in a club all night. And instead of sitting on his usual stool, he lay flat on his back on the studio floor and played the entire intricate part. He wasn't just playing the root notes. He was playing around the beat, pushing and pulling the rhythm, creating a sense of unease and movement that defied the simple 4/4 pop structure. His bass sings. It weaves in and out of the vocal, creating a counter-narrative, a second lead vocal. Marvin encouraged conversation. The party sounds in the background of the track are real. Marvin had invited several of his friends, including his new buddies from the Detroit Lions, Mel Farr and Lem Barney, to the studio. He wanted the song to sound like a street corner, like a real conversation, not a sterile studio product, But the most radical innovation was his vocal production. He recorded his main vocal, a smooth, pleading lead. But then he did something new. He recorded a second lead vocal, a rougher, more impassioned take, and had the engineer mix them together. And then he kept adding more. He multi-tracked his voice, layering harmonies, whispers, and ad-libs. He was singing a duet with himself. He was both the man asking, "What's going on?" and the voice responding with, "Brother, brother." He was playing all the parts, creating a community of voices from his own throat, a kind of one-man Greek chorus. It was a sound of profound loneliness and profound communion, all at once. The song was finished. It was a masterpiece. It was layered, deep, and hauntingly beautiful. It was also 6 minutes long, jazzy and political. It was everything Motown was not. And so, he brought the song to Berry Gordy. And Gordy, the man who had built an empire on 3-minute upbeat pop singles, was appalled. The confrontation was immediate. Gordy was not just a producer, he was a businessman. He saw this as a betrayal of the brand, a suicidal move. He called it too political, too long, too formless. He famously said, "Marvin, don't be ridiculous. This is taking things too far." He was afraid it would destroy the white crossover audience that Motown had worked so hard to build. He feared it would get them blacklisted from pop radio, offending the very establishment he had tried so hard to win over. He refused to release it. He shelved the song and considered the matter closed. But Gordy had miscalculated. He was not dealing with the young, pliable singer he had signed a decade earlier. He was dealing with a 31-year-old artist who had been through grief, who had absorbed the trauma of a war, and who had finally found his own voice. This song was not just another track. It was his truth. Marvin Gaye, the gentle prince of Motown, dug in his heels. He refused to record anything else. He went on strike. He told Gordy, "Release my song, or I will never record for Motown again." This was an unheard-of rebellion. No artist spoke to Berry Gordy this way. It was a game of chicken between the label's founder and its biggest male star. The standoff lasted for months. The song sat on the shelf. Finally, a Motown sales executive named Harry Balk, who had heard the song and loved it, saw an opportunity. He knew the song was connecting with a new, younger audience. While Gordy was out of town, Balk conspired with the quality control department to get the single pressed. They secretly manufactured 100,000 copies. It was an act of corporate insurrection. On January 20th, 1971, What's Going On was released. Gordy was furious when he found out, but it was too late. The song exploded. It wasn't just a hit, it was a wildfire. It sold 100,000 copies in its first day. It sold 200,000 in its first week. It shot to number 1 on the R&B charts and number 2 on the pop charts. It was a massive, undeniable, overwhelming smash hit. The song was everywhere. It was not just a hit, it was a cultural event. It was played on R&B stations, on pop stations, on college campuses. It perfectly captured the weary, mournful, questioning spirit of 1971. The Vietnam War was still raging. Soldiers were returning home, just like Frankie Gaye, and they heard their own story in this song. People at home, confused by the protests and the generation gap, heard their own anxieties. It was a song that didn't preach. It asked. It didn't offer answers. It just shared the pain of the question. Berry Gordy was many things, but he was not a fool. He was a brilliant businessman. When the sales figures came in, he immediately called Marvin. His confession wasn't one of artistic agreement, but of commercial respect. He reportedly said, "Marvin, I'll be honest, I still don't get it. But I'll tell you what, you've got 30 days to record an entire album of this stuff. This was the real escalation. Marvin, vindicated, took the challenge. He had been given an inch, and he was about to take a universe. In a legendary whirlwind 10-day recording session in March 1971, he created the What's Going On album. He had been thinking about these themes for a year. The music poured out of him. He produced it entirely himself. He used the Funk Brothers, but he used them in this new, liberated way, encouraging them to improvise, to stretch out, to be the jazz musicians they truly were. He wove the tracks together, one song flowing into the next, with musical and lyrical themes recurring, creating a single, continuous suite of music. This was a concept album for soul music, something previously reserved for rock bands like the Beatles or The Who. He expanded on the themes of the title track. The first song he laid down was the title track's B-side, God is Love. He then immediately recorded What's Happening, Brother, a direct conversational letter to Frankie and all returning vets. It wasn't a protest, it was a conversation, full of quiet pain. Can't find no work, can't find no job, my friend, don't you understand? Then, he turned his attention to the world outside, recording Mercy, Mercy Me, the Ecology. In 1971, this was groundbreaking. The first Earth Day had only occurred a year prior. An R&B hit, a soul song, about air pollution and environmental decay was unheard of. Oil wasted on the oceans and upon our seas, fish full of mercury. How much more abuse from man can she stand? This wasn't a protest song. It was a lament for the planet itself. Then, he brought it all home with Inner City Blues, Make Me Wanna Holler. This was the sound of the Detroit riots, the frustration of a generation trapped in urban decay while the government spent billions on the moon. Rockets, moonshots? Spend it on the slums instead. Crime is increasing, trigger-happy policing, panic is spreading. This was the song that connected the war, the poverty, and the despair. It was the final, angry piece of the puzzle, the release of the tension that had been building throughout the entire record, and he tied it all together with profound spiritual yearning in God is Love and Holy, Holy. It was a masterpiece, a complete, seamless, and deeply personal artistic statement. The What's Going On album was released in May 1971. It was a monumental success, spawning 2 more top 10 hits with Mercy, Mercy Me and Inner City Blues. It was hailed by critics as a work of genius, a landmark in popular music. More importantly, it shattered the Motown formula forever. Berry Gordy's assembly line had been broken by its most prized creation. The legacy of this one act of rebellion is immeasurable. First, it gave artists control. After this album, Berry Gordy had to loosen his grip. This album paved the way for Stevie Wonder's classic period in the 70s. Wonder, inspired by Marvin, marched into Gordy's office when his contract expired on his 21st birthday, let his old contract expire, and demanded and received full creative control. He used What's Going On as his primary leverage, pointing to it as proof that artistic, personal, and political music could also be massively successful. The result was Music of My Mind, Talking Book, Inner Visions, and Songs, In the Key of Life, some of the greatest albums ever made. Second, it changed the soul album. It was no longer just a collection of singles and filler. Marvin Gaye had proven that a soul album could be a complete, cohesive work of art, a song cycle that dealt with complex, adult themes, meant to be listened to from beginning to end. It elevated the entire genre, and third, it brought politics and social commentary to the forefront of pop soul. It proved that a song could be deeply political, socially conscious, and a massive commercial hit. It opened the door for a new kind of soul music, one that could be both smooth and subversive, beautiful and heartbreaking. Artists like Curtis Mayfield, with Superfly and Bill Withers would follow, creating some of the most enduring music of the decade. This album's influence continues to this day. Its themes are, tragically, still relevant, but its musicality, the way it blended jazz, soul, and gospel, created a blueprint for artists for the next 50 years. From neo-soul artists of the 90s to the socially conscious hip-hop of today, the DNA of what's going on is everywhere. It is preserved in the Library of Congress as a culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant recording. Marvin Gaye, through his grief and his brother's pain, found his own voice. He risked his entire career on one song, a song that his boss called "the worst thing I ever heard." That song, and the album it inspired, did more than just save his career. It redefined it. He broke out of the golden cage. He paid a high price for his artistry throughout his life. But with this one album, he created a timeless prayer, a question that, decades later, we are all still asking. What's going on? If you enjoy these deep dives into the stories behind the songs that changed the world, the tales of rebellion and genius that define music history, then this is what we do. Hit that subscribe button because there are so many more stories to tell.